Well, good evening again, everyone. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am again the MC for this evening. As you can see, also visible is David Adler, the President of the AJA, and Ted Lapkin, our Executive Director. So good evening to you as well, and as well as that to our guest for tonight, Shai Zarivatch, who we will introduce in a moment. The format will be as before. Tonight we will be speaking with Shai for about 30 minutes, after which we will open up the discussion with a live Q&A from the audience. So please have some questions ready for around 8:30. As usual, please signal your intention to ask a question by clicking on the Participants tab and then on the raise hand or green tick icon along the bottom, and that way we get a signal that you want to ask a question. The chat function's available as usual, so feel free to send messages, and I can see there are some already there. And of course, everybody has been muted to prevent those annoying noises during the first part of the session, but we will allow people to unmute themselves for question time. Now, tonight's session is a little different in that it is not all about politics of some sort, but in view of Israel's booming trade with countries around the world, we thought it would be interesting to hear from someone on the inside about the way this all works. Our guest tonight is Shai Zarivatch, who holds a BA and MA in political science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. 3 years ago, he became the Israeli Trade Commissioner to Australia. And this is important because this organisation focuses on Israeli companies looking to gain market penetration in other countries, not Australian companies trying to sell their products to Israel. So there's a different organisation that does that. Shai has vast experience in helping startups and fundraising investments, and he has assisted hundreds of companies with their market penetration efforts in his current and previous roles. And before moving to Australia, Shai was the director of the European Department at the Israeli Ministry of Economy, and prior to this, he served as the Israeli Commercial Attaché in Singapore. Shai, welcome to the Australian Jewish Association. It's nice to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, David and Ted, for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity.
Okay, Shai, just to get us started, could you give us an outline of what the Israel Trade and Economic Commission is all about, and what sort of work are you involved in?
All right, so the Trade Commission, the Israel Trade Commission, is the commercial office, the commercial operation of the Embassy of Israel here in Australia. We are part of the embassy, but we are located in Sydney, not in Canberra, where the rest of my colleagues are working and operating. And the work that we do, our responsibilities, our undertakings are all around increasing economic cooperation, increasing trade, increasing investment, and as you mentioned a few seconds ago, supporting Israeli companies and businesses, investors, startups who have interest to operate in Australia, who are interested to find business partners, joint ventures, whatever it is they're looking to find, and many of them are looking to find a lot, to do so and to do so successfully. And so we do all sorts of things, and we have all sorts of companies, all sorts of companies size, of course, different sectors, different industries, but this is what our office is all about. Myself and my team, our business development office, that is there to support the Israeli companies to penetrate, to operate, to be successful in Australia.
So a company in Israel, for example, might have a product that they want to sell around the world, and they think Australia is a good place for it. So they would then contact you and say, can you help us? Is that what happens?
That's the simplest term and way to describe it. Absolutely, yes. And so if you want me to, I'm happy to explain a bit further the way.
Yes, go into a little more detail.
So the way the system works, or maybe the philosophy behind it, I'll just describe it really quickly. Maybe similar to Australia, but quite different. Israel, a small country. I know all of your audience are familiar and have been there many times. But economically speaking, it is not different than Australia. It is not different from Australia being an island. Okay, and of course, this island is getting more friends in the Middle East, as we all seen yesterday and today. But altogether, economically speaking, in the immediate region where we are located, we are an island. And so to grow our economy, to build our country, you have to find partners and you have to find markets. And so to make a long story short, my office, the Ministry of Economy, puts significant efforts and utmost heavy weight in operating offices that will help the Israeli industry go global. I cannot even underestimate the amount of effort, budget, and support which is allocated to the part of the economy to go to global markets. Now, it's not something that we need to convince Israel is a global economy or has a global economy with a lot of advantages. But my office is part of this ongoing mission to provide help and support, to provide bridges, to provide assistance and market access to the Israeli economy. This is the overall outreaching philosophy behind it. We are no different than many other countries, but we are putting a lot more than if you compare it to the number or the percentage of the population. That said, the way to support companies is multiple. I mean, there's many ways and there's many bridges that you can lay forward. One is the simplest way that you describe. A company is picking up the phone, getting in touch, asking for help and support. But we are reviewed by our head office and by others, by value we create to sectors, not only company by company on a daily basis, which we do every single day. And the way to provide value to sectors is all sorts of initiatives, ideas, projects, which cater for a sector or an industry. And the sectors that we normally would work with, or that we would choose, or we will prepare our next year's work plan, are the sectors that Israel has competitive advantage in. And there are many, but if I need to summarize them into one, I would say whatever the sector is, tech, cyber technologies, agricultural technologies, medical equipment, and the list goes on.
So do you introduce people to other companies here, or is your role more of a governmental, bureaucratic, filling out forms sort of thing?
I get to enjoy both worlds. And the word that I enjoy the most is to speak, interact, engage, and do the work of a business development of every single company. Many times we find ourselves tending to our, if I may, our kids, but definitely our clients in Israel. We want to be working for you without us need to pay us or provide us anything. We are your outpost in Australia. Now, yes, there is a strong level of connectivity and accountability being government office, being government agency. But at the same time, there's enormous advantage because we don't have a bottom profit and loss number. I mean, we need to provide success. We need to provide traffic and success stories. So if I need to be admitting that I'm a government bureaucrat, I don't mind. But the language, the work, and the responsibilities are equal to every company, business, corporate that needs to show a bottom line.
Okay, so just looking at the world picture for a moment, who is Israel's biggest trading partners these days?
So Israel has many partners, not only trading ones, but the ones that Israel has economic interests, the one that Israel seeks and puts a lot of efforts, both on this, from the private sector and definitely from its government, and which are ultimately turning into the ones that say are trading partners, are no doubt historically has been, I guess, will be there for the longest time, are the European market, which we have substantial, complicated network of trade agreements, which gives preferences, which gives boost and support to Israeli companies, to Israeli businesses, to Israeli products to get into the European market. And equally, depends which year you're looking at comparing to, the United States, the American market. Now, this has been the case for the longest time, but for longer than a decade, because of all sorts of reasons and processes, political ones and others, Asia is certainly taking over. Certainly, Asia and the Pacific. No need to mention to the audience China. No need to mention India. Maybe I just give the following anecdote. When I joined the office, the Israeli Ministry of Economy, which is my home office, back in 2005, so 15 years ago, we had one office in China in Beijing, and we had one office in India. Today, there are 6 offices in China. To give you an idea about the amount of interest, the amount of work, the amount of the traffic of companies, businesses, startups, investors that are coming both ways is ever growing, and it will only get bigger. So altogether, if we are reviewing right now, I guess the American market is the largest, but in a year, 2 or 3, it will be very different.
Yeah, and as we're seeing in this country, trade with China is almost taking on a bit of a political flavour. Does that apply to Israel as well?
Altogether, and living here for 3 years, understanding the Australian mindsets, its many advantages and maybe some weaknesses, it could not be different. It could not be different. Because of geography, location, and the types of products, maybe commodities that we trade with each other are exceptionally different. Israel sells, exports knowledge. That's our prime, whatever the sector is, whatever the company is, it can be down into knowledge. It's not the case with the Australian export to China. We don't face the same. We don't live in the same neighborhood, and we are in a completely different situation. So it's not the same.
Yes, I suppose they don't really see anything in Israel that might be advantageous to them other than Israeli know-how. So whereas here they look around and they can see industry that they might want to get hold of. So perhaps that puts you in a much stronger position to function more as business partners without the political overlay.
Okay, I mean, I tend to agree, of course. Israel sees China as a positive, friendly nation and country, and we, as I mentioned, putting a lot of effort into ever increasing the level of relationship, the level of trade. We have only to gain from it.
Shai, I suppose there are countries that do not want to trade with Israel in any way. I mean, I guess Iran doesn't want to trade with Israel and vice versa. Does any of that sort of thing happen anonymously or quietly under the table?
Listen, Iran is an exceptional exception, and I wouldn't take them as an example.
Okay.
Iran is one of only 3 countries that Israel considers and have legislated a long time ago as an enemy state, not just as an unfriendly. One needs to make the difference. If you are referring to our changing Middle East region, neighborhood, for the majority of states and markets might not be friendly, but are far from being enemy, meaning an Israeli company would not be breaking any law in trading or doing business, investing, or finding any joint ventures with them. I'll give you an example. I think it goes to show. When I was in Singapore, my first posting, my responsibility and the office in Singapore till now is to push, support, and help companies go into Indonesia and Malaysia as well. Now, these countries, we don't have any diplomatic relationship, nor embassies or anything like this, or any trade agreement. Hence, doing business with them is significantly more difficult for Israeli companies. But we definitely try, or we see this in a positive way. We want to increase. We want to be present in the market as much as that possible. Iran is an exceptional country, no doubt, and we are in a state of not peace with them, and it's not about to change.
I have a question, Shai, and that relates to your time in Europe. And we look at what's happening there just in terms of the trade sense. We had Brexit, and it looks as though it's possible that the British and the EU will not be able to arrive at an agreement by the deadline on December 31st. I'm just asking your perspective as a trade envoy in terms of doing business. Do you think it'll be, now that the UK is out, and let's say that they revert to GATT rules, will that make it easier for Israel? Is it easier to, or is the EU bureaucracy so opaque and all-encompassing that it's really an obstacle, as some conservative-minded people would say, or does the centralization constitute more of an advantage? You just go to Brussels and solve it.
I fully understand the question, but if I hear it correctly, I guess you are referring to the multitude of complexities and the many factors, which many of them are nothing to do with free trade or with competitive advantage or with market access, rather than political or geopolitical other interests that Europe has in that part of the world, and certainly with regards to Israel, or maybe with Israel and its neighbors. And aside to it is the maybe earthquake or gigantic changes with Brexit, with Britain leaving the EU. On Britain, I mean, the answer is quite simple. We were one of the first countries, surprisingly enough, to sign a new bilateral, so Israel-Britain, trade agreement. So to continue the momentum, to continue the bridge that was there beforehand. This thing is done, sealed and done. So companies, businesses, investors, people, tourists, whatever it is, would enjoy the same benefits, the same preferences when it comes to entering, accessing your product, your technology, your service into the market. This stays the same. It was copy and paste with small changes. Now, Britain and the EU, it's their story, it's their problem, it's their issue, it's their choice. We are bystanders, and like anybody, any other country, are interested and curious to see what will the day bring. Israel and the EU, then again, a myriad of complexities. Altogether, scores of positive bridges, meaning agreements. And that's not just a symbolic or something that you put in a folder and back to the shelf. A free trade agreement, an enormous area of, again, agreements, but platforms for collaboration in R&D, research and development. This is Israel's strength, a lot of capabilities, a strong budgeting, and interest to partner with Israel. So the Horizon 2020, if you're familiar with that, so the EU overall platform for for investment and support for R&D, Israel is there. It's not about to change. There's been many stages in the past number of years that we're referring to, should we continue into the next stage, because the framework is a 7 years term, if we annex lands all sorts of other things which are nothing to do with trade. But this is the reality. And working in the Europe department, we shouldn't be surprised. By the way, it's just a small thing. There's a whole other range of issues with marking products from the settlements.
Yeah.
What would be considered an Israeli company? What would be considered an Israeli product to be eligible to enjoy entry to the European? I don't want to bore people who are not familiar. I don't think that's the point of the discussion, but all sorts of complexities, many of them are nothing to do with the advantage or with the product or with the quality, but rather than other reasons or issues that Europe is imposing or introducing.
Can I just to follow on from that a bit, Shai? So as you touched on, there are political implications in the EU. Would the EU ever lean on a European company to either not trade or change the way they trade with Israel because of those political implications?
The answer is a complex, but if try to simplify and answer in a simple way, there are two very different elements which are happening, but they coincide. One is the civil society, or lefty, liberal, perhaps Muslim, perhaps Jews, and whatever, civil society, which are pushing an agenda which is not government, it's not political, it's not elected politicians. I would altogether put it anti-Israel, and the anti-Israel comes, or it's the best way, easy way, is to go after the economy, go after companies, go after their products, go after the investments, go after them. Scores of examples. From I haven't been in Israel for 3 years. I've been here in Australia, but over the last number of years, it has, to some extent, I think, subsided. That's the feeling. I could be altogether wrong. On the other hand, there are the decision makers, the politicians, the governments, and the EU, and they issue directives. Directives are, for the most part, not must to adopt by the 28, 27 member states. They are not. It is elective, or majority are elective. Now, Europe is far from being united. Maybe everybody on the screen are shocked, but it's not. Many countries are far from being anti-Israel, exactly the opposite. So then again, we are living in an ocean of, or myriad of complexity. To answer your question, there's no, I don't want to sound too bombastic, excuse me, but there's no directive to boycott, God forbid. But there are all sorts of great blacklist companies that, according to them, are involved or allegedly involved in obstruction of human rights. whether it's banks, whether it's retail companies and alike. Okay. Then again, it's complex. It's complex.
Do companies in various countries around the world, I mean, I imagine they come along and say, look, we want to buy some Israeli product. What's this BDS thing all about? Is that something that you come up against?
Altogether, or in Australia, or?
Generally.
In Australia, zero, nothing.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Now, it's not that they don't exist here or there hasn't been attempts in the past. I'm well informed that there has been. And if one would Google or YouTube BDS Australia, some bad scenes will come up.
Okay.
But altogether, let me try to answer correctly, directly, but my way, with your permission. My understanding for the years that I've been here and the people that I've met and the scores of companies, governments, states, whatever that I came across or came across to us, there's so much positivity. There's so much interest from the private sector and the government sector to partner with Israel, which is far greater. It's far beyond the waste of the size or the importance you would assume that a small country like Israel in the part of the world it is located is there. It is enormous, and it comes from different realizations. And I'm happy to explain what this means. My understanding about the Australian economy and the Australian decision making and the Australian mindset is that you guys are in a crossroad. And this crossroad, I mean, leave China aside, leave the geopolitical challenges aside, though they are enormous, no doubt. The crossroad is this year have signified a change and realization that the ongoing blessing of economic growth, driving by all sorts of reasons that all of you are familiar with, but the resource industry, mining industry, education industry are not exactly sustainable and might not be the drivers of the economy for the next almost 30 years. There is an understanding, realization, maybe a concern. And there's also at the same time understanding and realization that we are the beginning, we just entered the third decade of the 21st century, and the third decade of, and this decade, this century, the 21st century, has one definite characterization: technology, digitization, information technology, AI, and all of those things that I can put in them into innovation. Australia has not exactly been there for the last 30 years. It has been there catching up in the last 5 to 6 years. And Israel has been there for basically ever since. So the desire to partner, work, learn, be friends with Israel is enormous because of an Australian understanding or realization. I would even go as far as saying, not that we have all the keys, but we have a few keys that we hold them. And it's not just the companies and the cyber and the entrepreneurs, and it is, how do you do this? How do you make it happen? How do you make it valuable? How do you invest and have valuable outcomes coming as a result? How do you not invest and nothing comes out of it? Particularly when it comes to government budget and money. And Israel have proved to the world or have demonstrated that they could be a strong competition to Silicon Valley. That's only Israel. And that budgeting, policy making, and mindset can be put together, make a difference and matter to the benefit of your economy. That's a strong lesson that many countries, but also Australia, my understanding, has learned and have knocked on our doors or knocking on my office door, so to partner with us.
Shai, thank you. Just before I move on to Australia, can you give us some success stories? Tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you've been involved in that have turned out particularly well.
Okay, so there's all sorts of, I mean, success stories has different interpretations, all sorts of. One success story is the fact that there's a growing number of companies that are not only coming here and they see Australia as a market, but they set up an office here and they hire people and they realize we are here to stay. And there's a growing number of companies, other than the one I mentioned, that realize that Australia is a place to stay, but to raise capital, to be public, to be open access to the public, to the market through public listing, IPOing, being an ASX listed company. And there's many companies that are finding partners and they are happy with them. And so they are selling their products, they're investing in, getting investment, all sorts of interpretations to what success looks like. Okay? But down at the bottom, eventually at the end of the day, end of the quarter, end of the year, companies need to sell and have income, revenue, sales coming in. And so cybersecurity companies are doing very well here. I can name 1, 2, or 3 doing very well here. Whether it's
Just before you get on to the Australian market, what about worldwide? I mean, I think of Elbit, for example, as a very big company. Which of the companies are particularly strong on a world scale?
So Israeli companies are strong on a world scale.
Okay, but in particular?
Variant, Checkpoint, NICE. Elbit that you mentioned is an interesting example because it is one of a few historically defense companies, but they have commercialized or they have scores of civilian applications, technologies, which are applicable to the civilian market, nothing to do with military or defense. And they have an office, an operation here in Australia, absolutely, down in Melbourne and in Canberra. Scores of other companies, businesses that are long ago are not only becoming global. From day one, they thought that the only way for them to exist and thrive is to be global. So they are global.
Okay. Okay, David, I think you had a question for Shai.
Well, I'm surprised in your own area, Alan, you didn't mention Teva Pharmaceuticals. One of the largest generic pharmaceutical houses, good example. Shai, we promised to show people the Israeli companies on the ASX, and you were kind enough to send me the list. So I'll find that and bring that up now. So we're not giving investment advice tonight, but this is the list that you sent. Do you want to make any comment about
yeah, I guess we have sent
how this is evolved?
Altogether, there are 21 companies to date listed. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's the one.
Shai, tell us a little bit about what these companies do. I mean, some of them will be obvious, but tell us a little bit about their products.
Okay, so there is diversity and difference between many of them. It's not that there's a cluster of one, but then again, all of them, best way to describe them are technology companies. There's no resource, there's no education, there's no aviation. They're all technology companies. I easily see and identify medical equipment, no doubt. Elsight, Essence, Fluence, G Medical Innovation are all medical equipment and medical devices. Not only the past number of months, not only through the COVID era, there is and I see also Cresco and MGC Pharmaceutical. Australia is considered to have, and all of you are familiar with this and know better than me, a very advanced, very Western have a healthcare system, and advanced solutions, advanced technologies definitely has a place here. So there's appetite, interest from the Australian side, and a desire, as you can see, from the Israeli side to be here, to find partners, to work with distributors, to offer solutions to hospitals and medical centers, as well as to be listed publicly here in Australia and enjoy the benefits of raising capital from investors.
Okay. All right, we'll take some questions from the audience. Now, Adam was first up. So, Adam, please unmute yourself and ask your question. And if anybody else has questions, just do the little signal on participants and raise hand, and then I'll come to you afterwards. Adam?
Adam, you can unmute yourself now. While he's working out how to do that, it was very interesting that on the White House today, the Prime Minister of Israel quoted from one of the Tehillim, one of the Psalms, Hashem oz le'amo yiten, Hashem yivarech et hamo v'shalom, that through strength, God giving strength, comes peace. And I think strength can be interpreted not just from a military point of view, but also from an economic point of view. And it wouldn't surprise me if perhaps not number one on the list, but one of the drivers that has resulted in the agreements that have been signed in the last 24 hours is indeed Israel's economic strength and what it can offer from its economic base to those countries in the Middle East that want to normalise relationships and trade more openly and have all the exchanges that entails. Do you think that's a fair point, Shai, that the economic strength has also been a driver perhaps towards the normalisation of relationships?
Exactly right. Could it be more accurate, David?
Okay. Now,
Adam, you need to unmute yourself if you want to ask your question.
we've got a few others. Alan, do you want me to?
Oh, can you unmute Adam?
I did, but he hasn't responded. So
okay. All right, let's go to Brian while we're seeing if we can get hold of Adam. Brian, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes. Is there any, when I last visited Israel, I found they were very, very strong in sustainability, clean tech and agri-tech. Now, Australia has, a lot of Australians are worried about climate change, but I've found that their sustainability is extremely poor compared to Israel. For example, Israel has the eco-ocean system. Australia complains about its barrier reef, but it has absolutely none of these systems in place, or like Oriole Park. Is there any move, or are you looking for somebody to try and influence the political side of the government to get more involved in the clean tech, the sustainability and the agri-tech?
So we don't normally give advices to the government, the federal one or the states. We're happy to be in touch, but seriously, we don't encourage or try to support, incentivize policy making in this country at all. You're mute, Brian. I cannot hear you properly. Brian, you're on mute. I cannot hear you.
Is he ask a supplementary question, Brian?
Brian, if you're speaking, then you need to unmute yourself.
He's back.
Has nobody expressed any interest in these products?
Okay, so I think best way to answer this question is the following. Aside from companies, businesses, investors, the private sector, government has a role. And while we don't tell or suggest policy making to any country that we are residing in, we do have all sorts of collaborations. Let me just mention two of them. So because Israel is a powerhouse of technology and innovation, and because I mentioned that there's an appetite and desire, realization, everything I just spoke a few seconds ago from the Australian side, which is only for the Australian purpose, nothing to do with the collaboration or the friendship that they have with Israel and any other country. There are research and development agreement platforms that have been created long ago, one with Victoria, actually in 2001, and a separate one in 2018 with New South Wales. And these agreements basically allow for entrepreneurs from both countries to come together, enjoy both joint funding to develop a technology, a solution, a service, which is for of an industrial application, not theoretical, not academic, of an industrial application. Basically, they have a product or a technology. And there are certain, it varies from Victoria to Sydney, to different platforms, to different agreements, but everyone has its own sector that it wants to promote, so to provide to their own economy or to develop their own cluster. And so agriculture is definitely relevant to both, and alternative energy solutions, clean technologies, environmental solutions, technologies are certainly on the cards for the two states.
Okay. Thank you. Now, just before I come to Michael and Moish, there's a question on the chat from Philip, and he asks, what interaction do you have with the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce? Can you just explain the relationship a little bit?
Sure. So the answer is very close, very friendly, and we speak and meet every other day. That's the answer. The Chamber of Commerce, AICC, Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce, is one of the Jewish communities, institutions, organizations that have been around 50 years. I know this because this year is the Jubilee. There's a 50 years anniversary. It is separate from us. Many times people make mistakes, confuse, or think we are the same. We are very different. The Australian AICC has 5 offices, I think, in Australia, in major cities, 1 in Israel. Now, altogether, they have, or they've taken upon themselves to do similar responsibilities, to bring, to connect, and to bridge between the industries, the economies, and companies, of course. AICC are doing all sorts of initiatives, or when things are normal and people can meet and gather, all sorts of initiatives, which some of them are nothing to do necessarily with Israel. It is being an Australian economic body. They are holding events and luncheons, and which are not to promote Israel necessarily. I'm happy to attend, I'm happy to go, I'm happy to be part, but they are catered for within, for the Australian business community to speak, to meet, to discuss issues and agendas which are domestic. And at different parts is quite similar to what we do. So delegations, bringing companies, supporting them, and many times we work together. Right? Some other times we don't.
Okay. Okay, Michael, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, Shai, I want to touch, you touched on 2 countries which are in our neighborhood, Malaysia and Indonesia. I mean, you were based in Singapore, so you must be very aware of these countries. I'm just curious to, firstly, can an Israeli passport holder enter both these countries, which are actually hostile to Israel? And is there actually any trade being done between Israel and Malaysia and Indonesia?
The answer is the following, but are you an Israeli citizen, Michael, with an Israeli passport?
No.
Okay. You want to be?
Yes. But
so
I'm just, yeah.
The answer is the following. I would argue a bit differently. They are not hostile to Israel, certainly not Indonesia. Maybe Malaysia, depends who's in power. And that's actually a very important point. But Israelis can visit and do whatever they want to do in these countries as far as Israel is concerned. You're not breaking any laws, you're not doing anything wrong if you visit, go, whatever you do in those countries using your Israeli passport. The thing is the following. Indonesia is much more liberal and open and allows Israelis to visit Indonesia for whatever reason or purpose. You just need to get a visa. Getting a visa is not so simple. It's not just applying online 48 hours in your passport. That's not the case. But there are ways, and as a matter of fact, it's not that difficult to get there for whatever reason, whatever purpose, certainly for doing business. The Israeli embassy in Singapore operates in Indonesia through a network of consultants like EY or McKinsey, not necessarily them, but business consultants that are providing us help and support for business for scouting and for business development within the market, finding partners, finding clients, as well as the process with visas. There needs to be a sponsorship, somebody that invites you. Long story, very technical, never mind. The process is durable, possible, not even that complicated, a little bit expensive. Malaysia is a whole different story. If I had the time, I'd be happy to elaborate more, but let me just say the following. On a typical average Malaysian passport, it says this passport is valid to all countries but Israel. That's a standard average Malaysian passport. Now, as far as Israel is concerned, we don't mind what it says. It is valid in Israel. If Malaysians want to go to Israel, they need to apply for a visa through the embassy in Singapore. And if there's nothing wrong, they will get a visa for whatever reason. Okay, there's a large, in both countries, group of Christian minorities, not even a minority, that adores Israel and goes there all the time when things are possible. To visit Malaysia, it's a bit more difficult. The Malaysians, I don't know if the audience on the screen would be interested, but after 2006, when Israel exchanged fists and fights with Hezbollah, what we refer to as the Second Lebanon War, they shut down this ability to give visas. Beforehand, it was pretty liberal, closer to the Indonesian model. Beforehand, it was closer to, you just need to have somebody inviting you and send a letter to the whatever office. It is much more difficult nowadays, for 15 years now. That's the reality.
And that's not going to change anytime soon, obviously, is it?
Listen, I have no idea. I don't have any knowledge better than anybody else. I do think, Alan, that we are facing not only changes within our immediate region with the 2 states that signed yesterday a peace agreement, and I hear on the news there's 5 more standing up in line. I think this is the beginning of a change which is very positive to the region, of course, to my country, which will echo much further. Basically the claim, if the Palestinian people cannot come to terms with Israel, how long do we need to wait? And it goes back to the question of the answer. This country, Israel, is not just somebody that we don't have peace with, so it looks nice on whatever board. It is a powerhouse. It holds keys.
Mm. Okay.
We're not doing anybody a favor, so to speak. I mean, maybe it will happen in 100 years' time. I don't know, but adopting not only company solutions that they do already, but the practices, the policies, how does a government make it matter and create a driver for the future is a recipe that many countries are very, very happy to pick, learn, and adopt. We're not doing anybody a favor.
Yeah, I guess our audience is very politically interested, which is why you're getting these questions. And I was just thinking that, when people talk about the Arab world, for example, one of the comments we often hear is, oh, well, it's not the people that are the problem, it's the leadership that's the problem. Does that apply to a country like Malaysia? Would Malaysians, the Malaysian citizens, be generally warm to Israel, but their government is not?
So Malaysia is a complex country of more than 60 million people with enormous amount of social conflicts within. I don't know how much you're familiar with the social structure and the politics of Malaysia. I know a little fair bit. Allow me to share the following. I think it's super interesting. Currently, there's no Jews in Malaysia, at least not that we know of. There used to be a Jewish community back in the 1900s. Long story, they all left to all the Western countries, all to Singapore. Malaysia is considered to be probably one of the only countries in the world which has rampant anti-Semitism with no Jews within their country. And anti-Semitism is used as a political vehicle, actually a very strong one. Every time there's elections, if you are living in Malaysia and you're following the political struggle, the campaign, Israel plays a role. What do you know? And it's a negative one. So clearly leadership has a role. Clearly they're playing cards. People, I guess nowadays when there's so many sources of information, I want to believe that it's not the case.
Okay. Moish, sorry to keep you waiting. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Moish?
Yes, okay. In terms of the philosophy of trade, if we can call that, if there is a philosophy to trade, I mean, I imagine Israel would have a different philosophy of the sort of trading, the sort of commodities, the sort of know-how it would share with democratic countries as against what it would share with non-democratic countries. So that's one aspect. The other aspect was there was an issue about the G4 network in Israel and where should Israel acquire it from, and United States making comments to Israel as to where it should acquire it from. We've got a situation with the sale of the Haifa port to China. Can you comment on those sorts of aspects of international trade or Israeli trade with the world?
Many questions, Moish. Which should I start with? G4, G4S, you mean? The British?
Yes.
G4S, right? The security. So I'm not sure.
The 4G, the telephone network, the 4G telephone network.
The 5G telephone network. Let me start with the first one. I'll do my best. We are an open, free economy. Very important for me to emphasize. We are an open, free economy. when we were not an open free economy, a company, a business person that wanted to go abroad, wanted to do business abroad, wanted to sell abroad or import to Israel would have to have all sorts of approvals, certifications, whatever. That's not the case anymore. We are an open free economy. We have freed a long time ago the degrees of the Israeli economy. And we signed numerous agreements that give us preferences and access to markets. So companies do what's on their mind. Don't need to report to anyone. I mean, depends what, but they don't need to ask permission and get certification. With exceptions to solutions which are either defense military or somewhere in the gray zone. And that, in this instance, they do need to be registered with the Ministry of Defense. And I'm referring to a myriad of all sorts of gray color technology solutions and products. Cybersecurity, definitely one of them. Homeland security is definitely some of them. Drone application, anti-drone application. These are not necessarily or far from being defense per se, but they correspond, they smell, or they have the danger of being one quite easily, or being utilized for the wrong reasons, as you put it, quite easily. So they are regulated. Okay. I mean, no need to get into the details. How does that work, and what counts yes, what counts no? But the answer to the question, very important for me to emphasize, is that I don't know. I mean, people have been to Israel in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We are not the same at all if you compare to then. We have freed the economy, and freedom the economy is we don't ask questions, we don't tell a company where to go, and we don't ask them to provide the approvals or certificates, unless it is highly regulated, like I just mentioned.
Okay.
So, laissez-faire. Okay, going back to philosophy of a freedom of economical freedom philosophy. Chinese investment in Israel, I mean, there's awareness. It's not that we are different than any other modern country. We are not indebted. I cannot see, and there's many projects that has taken place, but majority are infrastructure one, and asset one. The ownership or the buildup of the new port is an asset. The construction of the light rail is construction, right? It's an infrastructure investment. I don't see my country going into a debt that they cannot pay, so a foreign country would claim ownership on an asset. So, and then again, we cannot tell the private who to do business with, who to get investment from. That's critical infrastructure. There's noise in the background. It's a bit difficult to answer. So there's no clear-cut answer, and it's not yes or no China. If I need to choose, it's absolutely yes China. It's an important growing economic force. We want to be friends with this country. It has a lot of positive and valuable assets. Right? I mean, it's more about yourself than about the partner you're doing business with.
Yes.
In my view.
Can I just ask about the off-sea oil and gas and how you see that the let's say midterm, next 10, 15 years ramifications on the Israeli economy, particularly in terms of the proposed pipeline across the Mediterranean hooking up to Greece?
As much as we have just opened, or at least brought to light, two important small but significant economies of the Gulf, there are significant developments which are due to change and contribute dramatically, enormously in the future. And I'm referring to the establishment of an infrastructure pipeline that will enable export of natural gas from the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, Israel's economic border, altogether into Europe. It is under construction. It's called the East Med. It is under construction. Of course, in that part of the world, nothing goes easy with everybody agreeing and nodding their heads positively. Couldn't be more different. Turkey, Egypt, this and that, long story. Greece, Italy, long story. Because to put it very simply, there's gold underneath the ocean. There's natural gas underneath the ocean. In over the past decades, major findings of natural gas in Israeli natural gas in our economic waters. It's the eastern seabed of the Mediterranean. The largest one, called Leviathan, is due to be primarily exported into Europe. It is not functional yet. The second largest one, called Tamar Reservoir, is fully functioning, providing us with the alternative to fossil fuels burning coal and others, natural gas. So there's a small but steady transition of diverting and converting industries, manufacturing, factories, to be reliant and dependent on natural gas, much cleaner, much safer. With the establishment, I don't know exactly when, it's a bit, I need to look it up, but with the establishment and the functioning, the operation of this mega pipeline all the way to Europe, and after we get over all the difficulties with the countries that I mentioned, we are expecting to have something we never had before, and this is not just only exporting of natural resources, rather than income that will be invested within a national future generation fund, a sovereign fund.
Like Norway.
I don't know, Abu Dhabi, I don't know about Australia, I'm sorry. We don't have, there's such a fund already, it doesn't have $1 in its account.
Yeah, so like Norway. Norway, this is what Norway did with its
Exactly.
oil.
Precisely. So the benefits, and it will have a lot of restrictions. It's not, okay, let's use the money, far from it. Let's invest the money, it's for the next generations. But it is definitely, not only the findings is already there, there's other explorations, but once the pipeline will be connected and countries will buy from us, unheard of up until a few years ago, we are expecting our economy to get a boost. Our next generation to be more secure than they are today.
Yeah.
Amen.
Absolutely. Philip, do you have a question? If so, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, have I on? No.
Yes, you're on, Philip.
Okay. Shai, just quickly, what are the main products that Australia imports from Israel and sells to Israel? And what do you expect for the future? What sort of products are we selling to Israel, and are we buying from Israel?
All right, answer is simple. The balance of trade, overall trade per year, 2019, is a bit less than $1 billion, $850 million. The ratio, I don't know if you'll be surprised to hear, is 1 to 4, 1 to 5. So 250 Australian dollars, $1 billion export to Israel, and opposite incoming, sales or Israeli export to Australia. Australia, like Australia, is exporting to Israel agricultural products and live animal feeds, animals. Okay, not a surprise to anyone, I guess, right? But primarily agriculture products and live animals, cattle. We always like to say that the two countries the economies are complementary in each other. Luckily, we don't have a competition because, on the other hand, Israel exports its strength, and its strength is whatever the product, the technology, the company, or the business is. It is largely about knowledge, cybersecurity, financial technologies, medical equipment, data analytics, artificial intelligence, agricultural technologies, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
That's what Israel has to offer.
Okay, we're coming up to time. I've just got one last question for you, Shai. Sometimes when we see politicians, Australian politicians have gone to Israel and they come back and they're glowing and they say things like, well, Australia needs to learn from Israel. They do things really well. We've got a lot to learn from them. And when I see that, I think to myself, our cultures are very different. There's a lot that's unique about Israel that enables Israel to be the way it is. And I don't actually know that Australia can copy Israel. What do you think about that?
What do I think about it? Okay. I'm not here to give great suggestions what somebody should do differently or better. But it's not my role, it's not myself. I don't need to tell you, Alan, nor your 100 audience participants, that Australia is a great country with tremendous achievements that provides the highest standards of everything compared to any other country in the world. Okay, I need to say this or to remind this to anyone. No place is perfect. No place has all the gold and all the knowledge and all the. Our characteristics, Israel's characteristics, couldn't be more different than Australia's. Couldn't be more different because of the environment, because of geopolitics, because of necessity, because we had to be sustainable. Nobody came to our help. Nobody would fight for us. Nobody would build for us. Nobody would do anything for us. We don't import engineers. We don't import entrepreneurs. We don't. We do everything on ourselves. There's a culture of resilience. Luckily, we are majority Jewish people, so education is of an essence.
Okay.
Entrepreneurship is of an essence. Resilience is of an essence. Okay, these are very, very briefly and the characteristics of Israel, the Israelis. Okay, we were involved in our own nation building, and building a nation has many colors. Building one's economy is definitely one of them. Lack of natural resources. We've just spoken about natural gas, but it's only a recent finding. Lack of natural resources, lack of anything. You have to create yourself if you want to be, if you want to live, if you want to flourish, and if you want to provide to your citizens. And particularly in Israeli view, if you want to be the best place for people to immigrate if you're Jewish, not just we have a place to live under the sun, leave us alone, please. We want to be attractive. So yourself and your audience would think to yourself, maybe one day I would live there and I would not compromise the standard of living that I enjoy here in Australia.
Shai, when you're finished with the economic world, I think you'll find a very good position in the diplomatic world. You answered that very well. We're coming up to time. David, I'll just hand back to you, and thank you, Shai. David will do the formal thank you and let everybody know what's coming up next week.
Well, Shai, firstly, I want to thank you for making your time available for AJA this evening. You've clearly got a depth of practical knowledge and experience, and you're with a very Israel-friendly group, of course, which I hope makes it a little easier and a little bit more pleasant as well. I'm going to leave you with one final question, and that is, what can we as ordinary Australians do? Is there anything that you would like to see us do more of in supporting Israel, in supporting the commercial development of Israel, or should we just continue to be a platform as we are?
Thank you for your acknowledgements, David, and for the question. My feeling and my experience being here and living here is that the Jews of Australia, the Jewish communities, the different cities, of course, organizations, and God knows there's many of them, are exceptionally Zionist, exceptionally supportive, exceptionally doing, of course, I cannot speak on anybody's behalf, many people, but exceptionally successful as a community, as a group, and as individuals, and exceptionally involved, interested, and supportive of Israel. I mean, sometimes I think to myself that it's a bit difficult to compare, but compared to the American Jews, the unity which is here is 1,000 times greater than the disunity compared to Jews of the United States. Of course, depends where, both ethnically, both religiously and politically. Okay, so I'm not asking anybody to do more different or to get engaged. But if I need to answer your question, what could you do more for Israel? Be involved. As I mentioned, scores of organizations, right? There's one for everyone.
We will, and well, one of the things that we want to do more of, and we'd actually started it early this year, was to have our own mission to Israel, to see things that are of particular interest to our group, to meet people, to interact. And I'm hoping as soon as the travel restrictions are lifted, that we will be able to reactivate that initiative and join hands with others by visiting. I think that's something that we would like to develop a little more. Okay, finally, the last thing that we do is to foreshadow what's happening next week. And you can see on your screens now, hopefully, that next week we have Dov Lippman from Honest Reporting as our guest. If you're not familiar with Honest Reporting, they do a great job in holding media to account, which is always an enormous challenge. Unfortunately, Israel does attract some negative publicity, unjustified most of the time. So have a look at the website honestreporting.com and you'll see the work that that organisation does. And we have Senior Manager Outreach joining us next week and to deal with the subject of how we should deal with anti-Israel media. And finally, as usual, we ask that you support HAA in these three ways. Like and follow the Facebook page for the news and views items. If you're not yet on the email list, just send your name to office@jewishassociation.org.au and we will add you. And of course, we want people to become members and to provide some tangible assistance, and that can be done via the website. So, Alan, another great session. Thank you so much, and thank you to our guest, Shai from the Israeli Trade Commission.
Shai, thank you again. It's been wonderful to have you here. Thanks everybody for joining in. We look forward to seeing you again next week. So from us, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.